was Anglo-Saxon society and culture like? Well, let's look at the background first. The Anglo-Saxons were the people who came to Britain and settled after the Romans left in 410 AD. They originally came from what is now known as Germany, Belgium and Holland. They pushed the ancient Britons into Wales, Scotland and Cornwall. The Anglo-Saxons were to rule England until 1066. So what was their way of life like? So let's start off looking at the structure of Anglo-Saxon society. Now, the Anglo-Saxon structure was hierarchical in nature. It was what was known as a feudal system. At the top of the feudal system was a king. Below the king were the earls. The earls were trusted by the king to rule over large areas of land called earldoms. The earls were very rich and could pass on their land to their children. Below the earls were the thanes. Now the thanes had less land than the earls, but were still well off. They were local lords. They lived in manor houses, often with a tower and a church attached, and they were warriors. So they paid the heriot tax, which meant they had to maintain their own war gear like a horse, a helmet and a spear. The earls and the thanes together made up the aristocracy of Anglo-Saxon society. Below the aristocracy were the peasantry. Now the peasants looked after their local lord's land in exchange for a piece of land which they could till themselves to provide their own dietary needs. They lived in thatched cottages, usually with their own extended family. There were two types of peasants. The most infrequent type were the ceorls. Now the ceorls were free peasants, which means they were free to move from one lord's land to another. More common were the jebbers. Now the jebbers weren't free to move, they were tied to one particular lord's land. Below these peasants were slaves. Now slaves worked 6 days a week, doing whatever their master told them. They may have become a slave because they had lost in a war, or maybe because their parents were slaves, or even because they had asked to become a slave because they were facing starvation. So 85% of Anglo-Saxon population belonged to this group here. 15% were ceorls, 70% were jebbers, and 10% were slaves. Now linked to the feudal system was the division of land in Anglo-Saxon society. So earls looked after major areas of land called earldoms. For example, Northumbria, Wessex and Mercia were key earldoms. Earldoms were divided into shires. So I've got a picture of Robin Hood's hat here because a key shire was Nottinghamshire. Each shire had its own fortified town. So a fortified town is really a town with a wall and hills built up around it. 10% of people at the time lived in a town. London was the largest, followed by York, Winchester, Norwich and Lincoln, all of which were Anglo-Saxon towns. Now shires were divided into hundreds. Now hundreds was just a way to describe an area of land made up of 100 hides. Hide is about 120 acres, or 0.5 kilometres squared. So 100 hides is 1,200 acres. Hundreds were then divided into tithings of 10 households. So each tithing had 10 households. So this was the way the Anglo Saxons were able to divide and understand land, to be able to manage it and organise local governance. Now let's look at the Fyrd. Now the Fyrd was the name for the Anglo-Saxon army. There were two kinds of Fyrd members. The Select Fyrd. Now the Select Fyrd could be asked to fight anywhere. The Select Fyrd was made up of thanes who were fully trained and well equipped with horses, swords, spears. They often had military experience too. They could be asked to fight wherever the king wanted them to fight, as long as they weren't expected to be away from their land for more than 40 days. The General Fyrd fought only in their local area. They weren't well trained. Indeed, they were just peasants or slaves. They didn't have proper military equipment and instead fought with clubs, slings, axes, or farming equipment like scythes, which is what I've shown here. So if the king required a general army, he would ask his earls to ensure that the general fyrd were organised. Out of every 100, 20 men with some equipment were expected to be provided. So that equates to a soldier for every 5 hides. If 100 didn't want to send General Fyrd, what they could do is pay a fee for a mercenary to be sent instead. Now a mercenary would be a trained fighter who would fight alongside the thanes. So now let's look at Anglo-Saxon trade. Now, Anglo-Saxon England was one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. It had access to the sea and Flanders and Normandy via the English Channel, and Scandinavia via the North Sea. This led to strong trading ties. There were also strong trading towns which were fortified to protect from Viking attacks. They were known as burhs. Anglo-Saxon England also had a good climate for crops and livestock. There were 6,000 or more mills for grinding wheat, showing how successful Anglo-Saxon agriculture was. Anglo-Saxon society also had a sophisticated tax system. Trade had to be earned within the burhs, where it could be controlled and taxed well. The thanes had to pay heriot tax, which meant they had to provide their own war gear. Peasants had to pay land tax, and the earls kept 1/3 of this, but 2/3 of it went to the king as a form of geld tax. And it was the shire reeves that collected this geld tax and delivered it to the king. So Anglo-Saxon England was very wealthy and attractive to outsiders. So now let's look at religion. Now the religion of the time was the Catholic Church, and that had a lot of power. It had political power, because here you've got a picture of a crown with an ear inside. That is because there was a group of men who advised the king. Those men were called the Witan. It was a council, and on that council sat bishops. So in this sense, there was political power through religion. Also, religion had a very important role in the whole of Anglo-Saxon society because people were very conscious of the afterlife. The average life expectancy was only 30, so the afterlife and the thought of heaven and hell provided a major influence on people's everyday decision making. The Catholic Church and the Pope provided spiritual and political leadership. Bishops had an important status in Anglo-Saxon society. They were very well educated and they were very wealthy. They took control of church districts. The most famous Anglo-Saxon bishop was the Archbishop, who's the highest bishop of the land, Stigand. The bishops appointed local priests in each village. Now, the priests were not wealthy like the bishops. Indeed, they lived very much like peasants. Another reason why religion was important is because one of the few people that could read or write were religious clergy. So the church provided the clerks and the record keepers for the king. So altogether, religion had a major influence in Anglo-Saxon society. It was very present in people's everyday lives and also influenced political decision-making. Finally, let's look at law and order. So law and order was maintained through a system of collective responsibility, where collectives, rather than individuals, were held responsible if a crime was committed. The members of each tithing made a frank pledge, where they committed to catching a criminal together or each facing punishment for that person's crime collectively. So in the system that was known as the hue and cry, if a crime was reported, all the members of the tithing would go out together to try to catch the criminal, a bit like a citizen's arrest. This system could lead to blood feuding between families as each tried to avenge another's crime. One way to stop this was the Wehrgild. Now, this was a form of compensation. It was the agreement to pay money to the victim's family rather than to try to enact another form of justice. The amount of compensation would depend on the status of the victim. If a thane was murdered, it was expected that 1,200 shillings would be paid. That's equivalent to about £120,000 today. A churl would get about 20 shillings, £2,000. If a crime was taken to court, the local village court would decide if the man or woman was guilty. The earls, thanes and sheriffs were often involved in these courts. If there was very little evidence and the court could not decide, it was thought that God should decide through a trial of ordeals. For example, a hot iron would be put in the hands of the accused. When they inspected the hands of the accused a few days later, the wound was healing, they were thought to be innocent, if not guilty. Or there would be a trial by ordeal, where if they were drowned, they would be innocent, and if they floated, they would be guilty. Justice was very harsh, with corporal and capital punishment, and crimes against the king often being dealt with the death penalty.